Dear colleagues, dear audience, good morning to this early bird session. And we are very pleased to welcome you today to our panel Confronting Terrorist Violence and Resource Injustice, Local Communities and Vigilance Committees. Let me briefly introduce my colleague Brigitte Reinwald, Professor for African History at Leibniz University Hanover and my co-chair, and myself. My name is Wolfgang Gabbard, also professor at the University of Leibniz, professor for development sociology and cultural anthropology. We have the pleasure to chair this panel, as you know. The well-known German sociologist Max Weber defined the modern state as an apparatus of rule that successfully claims the monopoly on the use of physical force in a given territory. We all know very well that in many countries this is more fiction than reality. The state's monopoly on the use of force is repeatedly challenged by insurgents, criminal organizations, or other groups. Especially in marginal areas, be it shanty towns in Brazilian megacities or remote regions in the countryside, the state presence is often low. Sometimes, however, the state deliberately allows non-state actors, such as paramilitary groups, to exercise violence that is not subject to public control or legal restrictions. Where the state does not sufficiently protect the civilian population from violence or is not present at all, self-defense groups often form, such as vigilante groups or the so-called indigenous community police forces, Policías Comunitarias, in several states of Mexico. These are civilian self-defense groups made up of neighbors from the same communities who are dedicated to carrying out the surveillance and fight against organized crime that the responsible authorities have failed to do. Today, we will be able to discuss in more detail the causes and conditions for violence in areas of low formal state control and the ways in which the local population reacts to a situation of insecurity, often resulting from conflicts over the use of critical resources such as water, grazing areas, minerals, or crude oil, using 3 examples from Africa and Latin America. The schedule of the panel is as follows. We will first listen to the 3 presentations of 20 to 25 minutes each, starting with Christina, followed by Remaji, and then by Chukwuma. Then Gemma will comment on the 3 papers. Afterwards, we will have about 25 minutes for discussion. The audience is invited to ask questions and make comments. Finally, the speakers have the opportunity to respond. Remaji's talk will be in French with a translation into English. The equipment you can get outside this room. Now, I would like to briefly introduce our first speaker. Dr. Christina Dietz received her PhD from the University of Kassel in 2010. Since 2016, she has been a founding member of the German-Colombian Peace Institute, Instituto Capaz. From 2014 to 2019, she has been co-director of the junior research group Global Change and Local Conflicts at the Institute of Latin American Studies at the Freie Universität Berlin. She has been recently appointed professor of political science at the Development Studies Department at the University of Vienna. Her areas of work are environmental studies, political ecology, global political economy, Latin American politics and societies, democracy studies, agrarian change, social movement studies, and peace and conflict studies. Her most important recent publications include a series of essays and 2 edited books. One is Corona in Latin America, together with Stefan Peters and Christina Schnepel in 2021, and the second one is Contested Extractivism, Society and the State, Struggles Over Mining and Land with Bettina Engels in 2017. Christina, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Wolfgang, for that nice early bird introduction. And thank you for the organizers of the conference for inviting me and for organizing that exciting conference. So let me, it's already, yes, okay. Oh, that's easy. Back and next, I understand. Okay, so the title of my presentation is Violence Against Activists, Conflicts Over Resources in Colombia in Times of Peace. Since the signing of the peace accords between the former guerrilla FARC-EP and the Colombian government in 2016, it is estimated that around 1,400 social activists or leaders have been killed. Many more have been threatened with violence. Many had to leave the country. Due to these numbers, violence against social activists is high on the political agenda in Colombia currently. Social movement organizations, human rights organizations are mobilizing protests recurrently and demand the stop of the killing. NGOs, like in the past Somos Defensores, human rights organizations, have launched websites and platforms to give the affected leaders, the killed leaders, a face, give them an identity, and make them visible. The recently elected President Gustavo Petro, in his election campaign, promised to his voters that one of his main point or aspect or action will be to defend the life of social and environmental leaders. So what are we actually talking about when we look at violence against social activists from an historical perspective in Colombia? From that historical perspective, violence against social activists in Colombia is nothing new, particularly when it comes to rural areas and defenders of human rights, but also social activists that claim particularly fundamental rights like access to land and resources. When we look at this figure, which I took from the recently published report of the Colombian Truth Commission, which shows the number of victims and violence in Colombia over time and by type of violence between 1985 and 2018, and we are particularly interested here in the inner purple line, we can see that in the height of the armed conflict in Colombia between the 1990s and the 2000s, the number of killings were extremely high, particularly killings of social activists in rural areas. Only in 2002, the year with the highest rate of homicides, nearly 3,000 persons were killed in Colombia. But what calls our attention here is that between 2010 and 2017, the general rate of killings actually dropped. This is the time of the negotiation of the peace process in Colombia. However, of course, violence persisted. But what is mostly calling our attention now, if we look at the figure, is that since the coming into force, it's the last bit of the curve, since the coming into force of the peace agreement, the general rate of killings have been rising again, and especially violence and threats against rural social activists have increased. So the question that emerges from these figures and historical perspectives is how can we actually explain the continuity and the increase of violence against social leaders in the Colombian post-conflict context nowadays? In order to answer this question, I'm going to proceed as follows. First of all, I want to look at some characteristics and dimensions of violence against social activists, taking into account socio-economic, social-spatial, and political factors. Then, in the second part, I argue that in Colombia, the violence of conflict that we obviously have already studied a lot and that has to do with the, well, particular, I wouldn't say the not presence of the state, but a particular presence of the state in many of the rural areas during the violent period, is nowadays followed by something that I call the violence of peace, which is related to underlying structural inequalities and particularly the political economy of rural transformation in post-conflict settings. In order to make sense of this political economy of rural transformations in the countryside, I suggest to conceptualize this transformation with the concept of frontier or frontier expansion. In the conclusion, I'll sum up my findings and discuss what they might mean for the study of violence in peace processes. So first of all, where is violence against social activists taking place in Colombia at the moment? When we look at the map, first of all, we can identify three, let's say, hotspot regions, which is the southern part of the country with some of departments like Cauca, Nariño. Wie macht man das jetzt? Ah ja. Cauca, Nariño, Putumayo. Ah, okay. Putumayo, Caquetá. The western part, which is the department of Chocó and Antioquia, and northern regions, which is La Guajira, Cesar, Norte Santander, and Arauca, regions that are bordering with the Venezuelan border. All of these regions are particularly characterized by, first, the expansion of coca production in the last years, two, expansion of mining, industrial and informal mining in the northern regions of La Guajira and Cesar, and being strategically important for drug trafficking, particularly regarding the Cauca region, the Chocó in the Pacific coast, and these two regions in the northern border region with Venezuela. From a political, when it comes to political dimensions, what is also interesting to underline is that there is a high concentration of conflict or violence against social activists in the so-called PEDAD municipalities. PEDAD means Programs for Territorial Development after the peace accords. And the PEDAD municipalities are around 160 municipalities that were identified during the peace process or the negotiation process as being the most affected or mainly affected by the conflict, the historical conflict. And they have received over the last years a particular attention of rural development, of development policies, participatory processes, with a special interest or focus on structural transformation, e.g. with regard to land access and distribution. So most of the killings are taking actually place in PEDAD municipalities. So what stands out from these maps and figures is that violence against social activists is, first of all, a rural phenomenon, and it is spatially concentrated. And it mainly affects activists in provinces and municipalities that are already severely affected by the conflict, in which the FARC, the former guerrilla, the biggest former guerrilla organizations, there are others still operating, controlled large areas, and that with their withdrawal created a power vacuum. It is regions where the drug cultivation and trafficking is a central economic element and is expanding. Since 2016, the area of coca cultivation has increased significantly in Colombia. It is areas where mining, formal and informal mining, and agro-industrial production modes are expanding, and it is regions that possess a historically high share of organized indigenous, black, and peasant population. This is particularly true for the Cauca region with the most strongest indigenous organization in the country. It is finally, and this kind of binds them all together, regions that are characterized structurally by historical social inequalities, particularly when it comes to the distribution of land. Who are the activists and what do they actually stand for affected? So when we look at this figure that I took from the multimedia platform La Silla Vacía, we can identify that it is mostly communal, indigenous, and peasant activists that are being affected, followed by those struggling for the substitution of coca, the access to land, and the restitution of land that have been taken away from farmers from which they have been displaced during the conflict. It is activists that are defending human rights, existing livelihoods, and the environment. The affected social activists are mainly men, which does not mean that there are a considerable number of female and queer activists that have been killed. What I want to underline when looking at this figure is that the high degree to which communal representatives, it's the so-called representatives of la Junta de Acción Comunal, it's like representatives that at the lowest political administrative level represent community interests. So the high level of these people being killed, indigenous peoples and peasants, underlines from my reading that violence against social activists in Colombia is a focused attack on the exercise and claiming of fundamental political rights of participation and democratic decision-making by those that have historically been kind of marginalized or excluded. And it is as well a struggle or an attack on the claiming of the recognition of group-based cultural and social rights. So from this reading, we can first kind of conclusion that we can draw is violence against social activists has a class, gendered, and racial dimension. So how can we understand the peace process in Colombia when we take into account this kind of ongoing continuity of violence against social activists? In order to explain the continuity of this violence, I think we need a differentiated understanding of the post-conflict situation in Colombia. Since the signing of the peace agreement, at the national level, several mechanisms of transitional justice have been more or less successfully being implemented. The DDR mechanisms, the Truth Commission has been installed and already published its final report. A Special Justice for Peace Court has been installed and is operating quite well, actually. And there have been many other institutional reforms that are with more or less satisfying results. However, I'd argue that Colombia cannot simplistically, in terms of transitional justice, be understood as a country in transition into peace, as this would, from my reading, entail the achievement of one of the main goals of the peace agreement, and that is territorial peace. Territorial peace is a concept that emerged during the negotiations and that focuses particularly on peace process in the territories mainly affected by the Colombian conflict. It not only entails the elimination of physical violence, but also and particularly of structural and systemic violence, that is, the elimination of social inequalities that, according to Galtung, I'm citing, harm people by preventing them from meeting their basic needs. Such territorial peace is not in sight anywhere in the country. What we are witnessing instead in Colombia is something that Jonas Wolf and I in 2018 called divided peace. It is a divided peace between the peace process at the national level and the enduring violence on the ground. In other words, it's a peace with violence. This resonates with anthropological conceptualizations of violent transitions, e.g., Paul Richard's concept of no peace, no war. Richard argues that civil wars in the global south seldom result in clear-cut peace, but more generally stem into no peace, no war times when war is no longer a prevalent social activity, but violence or the threat of it remains present. The violence of peace, as Christian Lund calls it with reference to the Indonesian peace process, happens at different scales and is much more localized. Nevertheless, and taking this concept to the Colombian context, nevertheless, it disrupts the spirit of justice, resistance, inclusion, political participation, recognition, and redistribution that runs through the Colombian peace agreement. Lund argues that as a moment of rupture, a peace agreement reveals interests, powers, and dynamics and offers an opportunity for many state and non-state actors to territorialize these interests. This is actually what I think is happening in many rural settings in Colombia, particularly in those areas from which the FARC withdrew and where other formal and informal powerful actors, mining companies, large landholders, drug clans, state actors, seek to enforce their political and economic interests. Access and control over land is thereby central. So violence against activists in Colombia in rural settings is in many cases bound to historical conflicts over land. These conflicts can be seen in terms of frontier expansion, I argue. A frontier is a particularly space-time configuration. It is related to the discovery or invention of new resources, the expansion of capital, or the territorialization of power and authority. At frontiers, existing social orders are dissolved, for example, property systems, political jurisdictions, rights, and social contracts. And new social orders are being established. Frontiers, then, are about the contentious reconstitution and negotiation of new territorial orders. The use of direct violence is not an essential feature of frontier conflicts. However, according to Charles Tilly, conflicts turn into acts of direct violence, including killing, etc., when, I'm citing, the proponents of competing social and territorial orders are in contestations, or when a new or dominating order is not accepted, internalized, or combated. Communal leaders, peasant and indigenous and black communities organize protest currently in Colombia against the destruction of their livelihoods and for the recognition of their fundamental rights. In frontier terms, this means they struggle against the imposition of a narco, extractivist, or capitalist agrarian order. This is met with direct violence or the threat of it when these activists protest against this order, when activists protesting against these orders are by those that seek to impose these orders are considered obstacles that must be eliminated or at least displaced. I have asked at the beginning of this presentation how the continuity and increase of violence against social activists in Colombia can be explained in the context of the post-conflict situation. What I wanted to offer here is one explanation. There are probably many others, or this is only one dimension of a more complex explanation. What I want to conclude is that the current conflicts over territorial orders in Colombia turn into violence because they're taking, to a certain extent, because they're taking place under conditions of severe social inequalities. Why are they becoming particularly violent? There is a lot at stake, actually, economically, and in terms of pure survival and existence. From these findings, I argue that for a better understanding of the continuity of violence in post-conflict settings, an analysis of the political economy of peace is important. But I'm not a really expert in this literature. Nevertheless, from what I know is that this political economy of peace perspective is often missing in scholarly debates on war and peace. In order to conceptualize the political economy of peace, particularly when it comes to land and resources, I suggest that the concept of frontier and frontier expansion could be helpful to fill this gap. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christina. Good morning to the audience. Thank you very much, Christina, for this intriguing presentation. I'm sure it will strike a vein, or more than a vein, with our ensuing presenters. So, against the schedule you see above here, we will continue with Dr. Remaji Hoinati, an anthropologist de formation from Chad. Remaji is a senior researcher at the Institute for Security Studies, ISS, since 2019. Just two sentences on this ISS, because it also touches on the issues of our conference. This is an African non-profit organization based in Pretoria, South Africa, with regional offices in Kenya, Ethiopia, and Senegal. According to its mission statement, ISS and partners aim at enhancing human security as a means to achieve sustainable peace and prosperity. Their work covers transnational crimes, migration, maritime security and development, peacekeeping, peace building, crime prevention and criminal justice, and the analysis of conflict and governance. Remaji is based in N'Djamena, the capital of Chad, and works closely with the Dhaka office in the Lake Chad Basin program. Here, he is responsible for fundraising, the elaboration and conduct of research projects on the human security challenges in this region, the dissemination of research results at public events, conferences, seminars, and media engagements. From 2008 to 2019, Remaji was the founding director and coordinator of CRASH, the Research Center in Anthropology and Humanities in N'Djamena. Already an experienced policy research manager, he built it from scratch by raising donor funds, developing strategic and scientific partnerships with local, national, regional, and international stakeholders, and establishing a network of Chadian researchers. Remaji has also been serving as associate lecturer in the Department of Anthropology at the University of N'Djamena. He is, moreover, well acquainted with the German academic landscape, a former fellow of the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology in Halle an der Saale, here in Germany. He gained his PhD in anthropology in 2012 at Martin Luther University in Halle-Wittenberg. And finally, from 2013 to 2017, he held a postdoctoral grant by the Volkswagen Foundation in the still ongoing and yesterday mentioned funding initiative Africa Knowledge for Tomorrow in the Humanities section. Remaji's initial research focus was on natural resources and their government, as becomes apparent in the title of his dissertation, published 2013 in French, which translates as Oil and Social Change in Chad, Oil Rent and Monetization of Economic and Social Relations in the Doba Oil Zone. In his ensuing research projects, numerous articles and chapters, as well as policy briefs with ISS, he concentrates on various socio-political dynamics in Chad, including migration and conflict, religious diversity and radicalization processes, religious-based violent extremism, and security governance. In this respect, the Greater Lake Chad Basin, comprising the bordering regions of Cameroon, Niger, and Nigeria, is one of his priorities. Human security challenges in the Lake Chad Basin region, the structural weakness of security governance by its surrounding states, and the contribution of vigilante and community self-defense groups in fighting Boko Haram are also at the core of Dr. Hoinati's presentation today. He will talk in French. Wolfgang already mentioned it with an English translation, but the discussion afterwards will be in English. So, without further ado, I now hand over to Romaji. Please.
Bonjour à tout le monde et merci pour ce Reinwald pour cette présentation et aussi pour l'introduction de l'ISS. Je m'excuse de devoir changer de langue, mais je suis content de vous ramener aujourd'hui à la question du vigilantisme qui a été discuté déjà hier. Et le papier donc, que je présente porte, comme le professeur l'a dit, sur la zone qui se situe aux confins des 4 États que sont le Tchad, le Cameroun, le Niger et le Nigeria, c'est-à-dire le bassin du lac Tchad, et qui se situe dans un contexte de crise depuis 13 ans aujourd'hui par la présence du groupe Boko Haram. Et ce papier prend appui en termes de méthodologie donc, sur un ensemble de recherches conduites dans le cadre du think tank dont le professeur a parlé, mais il prend aussi appui sur un travail de monitoring continuel de la situation de conflit donc, dans cette zone à travers des descentes sur le terrain, mais aussi un scanning au quotidien donc, de toutes les publications des médias, mais aussi des milieux universitaires à propos. Je vais donc rapidement présenter le contexte dans lequel j'ancre cette discussion, tout en sachant que c'est un contexte que je veux moins académique que la plupart de ce qui a déjà été discuté. Perspective de think tank oblige. Je vais ensuite parler de la présence de l'État dans les zones dont nous parlons, de comment cette présence est limitée et occasionnant ainsi la création des groupes de vigilance et ensuite discuter cette question en termes d'avenir de ces groupes pour l'avenir de cette crise dans le bassin du lac Tchad. Et la problématique des groupes de vigilance est donc une question qui revêt une importance particulière dans les zones frontalières du lac Tchad parce qu'au-delà, n'est-ce pas, d'une simple question ad hoc de répondre à une nécessité de se défendre, se joue surtout toute la question de la gouvernance en fait sécuritaire en zone de crise dans ces pays-là. Et l'argument ici, c'est que la montée en puissance de ces groupes, même si dans le contexte actuel apparaît comme un mal nécessaire, est sur le long terme un défi capital pour les États déjà à la gouvernance sécuritaire fragile et devrait donc être dès à présent considéré dans toutes les recherches de solutions ante et post-crise. Par rapport au contexte de discussion, je n'entends pas ici faire un débat détaillé sur ce qu'est la sécurité, mais les définitions minimales de la sécurité, le plus souvent, sont des définitions qui s'attardent sur les dispositifs et les pratiques de sécurité. En ce sens, donc, mettant en avant, si vous voulez, les questions de défense et le rôle de l'État comme acteur central. Mais plus loin, il y aura le concept de sécurité humaine, qui ont été entre autres par le PNUD à partir de 2014, qui va nuancer cette compréhension en consacrant cette fois-ci la place de l'individu et des communautés comme élément central de la sécurité, qui désormais donc englobe, n'est-ce pas, d'autres types d'éléments interliés comme l'économie, la santé et l'environnement. Ainsi donc, la sécurité, dans cette compréhension, n'est plus qu'un élément de devoir régalien ou de prérogative centrale de l'État lié à l'exercice de la force légitime, mais aussi et surtout un service au même rang que l'éducation, la santé et tout le reste. Et en tant que service public, donc, la sécurité intègre désormais le domaine de la gouvernance, qui peut aussi désigner tous les processus l'ensemble des acteurs et des valeurs formelles et informelles qui influencent la prestation de toutes sortes de biens publics, parmi lesquels la sécurité. Et il y aura donc le vocable de gouvernance sécuritaire. Et selon Keita, que je cite ici, la gouvernance sécuritaire recouvre la constellation d'institutions formelles ou informelles, gouvernementales ou privées, n'est-ce pas, commerciales ou bénévoles, en charge du contrôle social et de la résolution des conflits et qui participent à la promotion de la paix en anticipant les menaces réelles ou ressenties résultant de la vie en société. Comme telle donc, cette définition ouvre désormais le domaine de la sécurité aux acteurs non étatiques de niveaux de formalisation et d'institutionnalisation très variés. Ceci pose derrière la question de l'exclusivité de l'État comme détenteur de l'usage de la force, de la protection et de la sécurité. En effet, quelle légitimité peuvent avoir les autres acteurs de niveaux si variés? Et comment les règles édictées pour faire fonctionner le secteur de la sécurité peuvent-elles être appliquées à un foisonnement d'acteurs de niveaux si différents? Même si l'État n'est plus le seul acteur à recourir à la violence de manière légitime, l'État demeure quand bien même le seul disposant de la légitimité de réguler et de contrôler l'usage de la force dans l'intérêt supérieur de tous. Ceci induit que tous les acteurs, pour être légitimes, doivent être soumis à un minimum de régulation ou de contrôle de la part de l'État. À propos des groupes de vigilance, je pense qu'il y a les recherches qui ont été présentées hier, mais il y en a beaucoup d'autres qui documentent justement cette question dans les zones en crise comme le Burkina Faso, le Mali actuellement, mais avant cela en Tanzanie, en Côte d'Ivoire, en Sierra Leone et au Libéria. Le plus souvent donc, le vocable de groupes armés non étatiques est régulièrement utilisé pour englober ces groupes sans faire une différence en fait dans leur diversité. Mais dans notre cas, nous nous limitons dans notre analyse aux groupes qui sont orientés vers la sécurisation des communautés et de leurs biens, recourant ou non à la force, avec un niveau minimum de reconnaissance ou d'aval de la part de l'État. Et bien souvent, comme ceci a été discuté hier aussi, c'est l'incapacité des États à mailler leur territoire, à garantir la sécurité et la protection des citoyens contre les bandes armées ou bien contre d'autres communautés, n'est-ce pas, qui rend nécessaire leur engagement dans cette entreprise donc de vigilantisme. Ainsi vont naître les groupes d'autodéfense, les milices communautaires, les groupes de vigilance, etc. Pendant que certains de ces groupes sont créés de manière ad hoc sous la nécessité de se défendre, d'autres sont le résultat de la reconversion de groupes ancrés dans les communautés depuis plus longtemps, comme les confréries des chasseurs notamment. Donc, devant l'incapacité de l'État à assurer seule leur sécurité, ces groupes vont devenir de véritables supplétifs de ce dernier dans les zones en conflit. Revenons à la zone qui nous concerne, c'est-à-dire le bassin du lac Tchad. C'est une large zone donc, qui, je pense, peut englober en même temps l'Allemagne, la Belgique et la France, si on considère l'ensemble des zones touchées dans la sous-région. Et je le disais, donc, c'est dans cette zone, pour rappel, donc, le groupe Jamaatou al-Sunna lil-Dawati wal-Jihad, connu dans les médias et ailleurs comme Boko Haram dans ses différentes factions, prend naissance et s'enracine dans un contexte situé dans la périphérie des États, donc avec une présence très moindre des États et alors très propice à son développement. Ce groupe va devenir violent à partir de 2009 et va se régionaliser en sortant du Nigeria pour s'implanter dans les 3 autres pays à partir de 2014. Il faut le dire, en 13 ans de conflit aujourd'hui, n'est-ce pas, c'est plus de 40 000 morts et depuis 2021, Boko Haram est cité dans l'index international de la terreur comme un des groupes les plus sanglants et le Nigeria, un des pays les plus impactés par le terrorisme dans le monde. Donc dans cette zone, je le disais, la présence de l'État n'a pas toujours été systématique, entre autres à cause de l'excentricité de ces zones, de leurs difficultés d'accès, mais aussi des politiques simplement incapables de prendre en compte ces zones périphériques. D'un point de vue historique aussi, il faudrait dire que c'est une zone qui a été pendant longtemps marquée par la violence, déjà dans la période précoloniale, par la compétition entre les différents royaumes qui se sont succédés dans ces zones, par des tentatives de djihad dans cette période déjà, puis se superposera à cela la conquête coloniale qui n'a pas été moins violente, et dans la zone, dans la période post-indépendance, des pays comme le Tchad ont connu des guerres civiles, le Nigeria de l'autre côté, le grand banditisme, faisant que c'est une zone qui a toujours été dans une sécurité relative. Et c'est dans donc cette circonstance que Boko Haram va advenir. Parlant de la limite de la gouvernance ou de la présence de l'État dans ces zones, il faut le dire, et je le dis déjà, je pense, depuis le début de cette présentation, l'absence du contrôle global des territoires nationaux et plus encore des zones de frontières a favorisé, avant Boko Haram déjà, le déploiement d'acteurs et d'entrepreneurs de la violence qui infestaient ces zones. Profitant aussi de la porosité des frontières, ces acteurs ont toujours eu une approche régionale de leur action pendant que les États étaient limités dans les espaces de leurs frontières. Par ailleurs aussi, il faudra le dire, même si la présence de l'État avant Boko Haram a été relativement limitée, cette présence s'est surtout manifestée quand elle a été sous le visage militaire, donc accompagnée d'abus et d'insuffisances qui ont dans beaucoup de cas affaibli en fait le contrat social entre les gouvernants et les communautés dans ces zones. Donc, si ce contexte a été propice à la mise en place des économies criminelles et de l'extrémisme violent, c'est aussi ce contexte qui va être très propice en fait à la naissance et l'enracinement des groupes d'autodéfense. Dans la réalité, les groupes d'autodéfense ne sont pas en soi une nouveauté extraordinaire dans cette zone parce que les communautés ont déjà dû se mettre ensemble pour se défendre. Mais ce qui est inédit, c'est l'ampleur du phénomène actuellement. L'ampleur de la violence de Boko Haram et l'ampleur des insuffisances de l'État dans la défense des communautés fait donc que le phénomène va prendre des proportions assez grandes. Donc, à partir de 2013, lorsque Boko Haram est à son apogée et que les services de défense nigérians ne parviennent pas à circonscrire la violence, les communautés des États les plus touchés, donc dans l'État de Borno, de Yobe et de l'Adamaoua, vont être contraintes de se mettre en place pour se défendre. Et on se rappelle, n'est-ce pas, des actions d'envergure de Boko Haram, notamment l'enlèvement de 200 filles au vu, n'est-ce pas, et au su des services de sécurité en 2014 dans la zone de Chibok. Devant de telles situations qui se répétaient, il ne restait aux communautés qu'une seule solution, devoir donc prendre les armes. Et les communautés dans la zone de Difa au Niger, du nord et de l'extrême nord du Cameroun, mais aussi du lac et de la Djerlamis au Tchad, vont leur emboîter le pas. Il faut dire donc que, de manière générale, on parle de communautés se mettant en place pour se défendre, mais les groupes de vigilance et d'autodéfense dans cette zone ne sont pas tous les mêmes selon leur origine, leur mode et moyens d'action, mais aussi leur envergure. Pendant que certains groupes sont mis en place de manière ad hoc en réponse à l'insécurité, d'autres sont simplement une conversion ou une extrapolation, comme je le disais, de groupes déjà existants, des confréries de chasseurs, comme on a vu en Afrique de l'Ouest avec les Dozo ou bien les Koglogo au Burkina Faso. Les autres groupes sont composés de volontaires, mais là aussi au background très divers. Ce sont des jeunes et des moins jeunes, membres des communautés concernées, des fois avec un passé dans les forces de sécurité officielles, mais de l'autre aussi, des fois avec un passé dans les bandes armées non étatiques, ça veut dire le grand banditisme, les rébellions que le Tchad a connues, les milices communautaires, etc. Et l'expérience dans le maniement des armes, donc à un niveau ou l'autre, devient très important ici pour intégrer ces groupes. Et l'ampleur de la situation sécuritaire dans les 4 pays n'est pas non plus le même. Le Nigeria étant l'épicentre de ce conflit, est le pays le plus touché. Donc ainsi, au Nigeria, il y a un foisonnement de ces groupes de différentes capacités. Il y a par exemple les Civilian Joint Task Force, les CJTF, d'un côté, il y a les Hunters Groups, il y a les Vigilantes Groups of Nigeria, ça ce sont les grands groupes qui sont reconnus par l'État, n'est-ce pas? Mais il y en a beaucoup d'autres en fait qui se mettent en place. Au Tchad, au Cameroun et au Niger, ce sont exclusivement des groupes de plus petite capacité qu'on appelle les comités de vigilance ou bien les comités de vigilance et de sécurité. Par rapport à la reconnaissance de ces groupes, bien souvent, ces groupes sont, comme je l'ai dit, l'émanation des communautés d'abord. Et la première autorisation que ces groupes reçoivent, c'est la bénédiction des autorités locales, chefs de village, de cantons, de communautés, ou bien les lamidos. Et l'État va se retrouver dans l'ensemble des 4 pays à simplement prendre acte de ces groupes, constatant sur le terrain une certaine efficacité et une certaine capacité à protéger les communautés et leurs biens. En effet, l'avantage de ces groupes, c'est que, étant issus des zones concernées par l'insécurité, les membres de ces groupes ont une meilleure maîtrise physique, n'est-ce pas, anthropologique et même culturelle, et des modes d'action de l'ennemi en face, ça veut dire Boko Haram. Les autorités vont donc simplement prendre acte de la présence de ces groupes et les reconnaître comme des auxiliaires de premier ordre dans la lutte contre Boko Haram. On se retrouve alors dans une situation où l'État admet l'usage de la force aux mains de groupes d'émanation totalement communautaires et informels. Cependant, dans une situation où la sécurité est délétère, l'État se retrouve embarrassé parce qu'obligé d'un côté d'adouber ces groupes et de les associer à la lutte contre Boko Haram. Reste, comme je l'ai dit au départ, la question de quel contrôle sur ces groupes. Ici aussi, le Nigeria va se distinguer en termes de contrôle. En effet, au Nigeria, l'ampleur de l'insécurité va faire que les États vont très vite reconnaître les groupes et essayer de les formaliser. Et contrairement donc aux autres pays, n'est-ce pas, les groupes au Nigeria ont un certain niveau de structuration en termes d'organisation, de règlement intérieur, de concept d'opération ou bien de serment pour entrer dans ces groupes. Le soutien des autorités va aussi être très différent parce qu'au Nigeria, l'État va très vite reconnaître ces groupes en leur donnant des moyens logistiques et malheureusement aussi en fait des moyens létaux. Ça veut dire des armes de pointe pour le combat. Et ces armes viennent s'ajouter aux armes artisanales qui existaient déjà dans ces zones, mais aussi aux armes sophistiquées que le marché noir rendait abondant dans ces zones après les conflits du Tchad et du Nigeria. En ce qui concerne le Tchad, le Cameroun et le Niger, la formalisation est moins avancée et l'appui de l'État est limité à des moyens non létaux. Donc, dans les autres pays, si ces groupes accèdent aux armes, c'est plutôt à travers le marché noir et ça reste aussi des armes artisanales. Au-delà des moyens létaux que l'État nigérien a donnés, ils sont allés plus loin dans la tentative, n'est-ce pas, de structuration et de formalisation des groupes de vigilance en formant les membres de ces groupes à l'utilisation des armes et à l'engagement militaire sur le terrain, mais en essayant aussi d'intégrer certains au sein de l'armée, de la police et des autres services de sécurité. Pour résumer donc sur cette partie, il faut dire que au-delà en fait de l'équipement, il faut dire que les groupes de vigilance dans les 4 pays sont de nature différente, d'envergure et de capacité très différentes. Et bien que dictés par la nécessité, ils vont recevoir aussi des types de soutien et de tentatives de formalisation très différentes. Pendant qu'au Nigeria, ils sont devenus à ce jour de véritables milices offensives, c'est-à-dire engagées dans le combat aux côtés de l'armée. Dans les autres pays, ils restent encore, n'est-ce pas, dans une position d'apport à la sécurité préventive. Et dans la réalité, donc, les comités de vigilance dans le combat contre Boko Haram restent quand même une réalité à 2 facettes. Parce que dans la proximité, n'est-ce pas, et l'immersion des groupes, comme je l'ai dit, leur donne un certain avantage dans le combat, avec une capacité à rassembler l'information, le renseignement, le mettre à la disposition des forces de sécurité, avec une capacité à détecter les éléments suspects, à débusquer les attaques, mais aussi à empêcher notamment les attaques kamikazes sur les marchés, les mosquées, etc. Mais, restant un couteau à double tranchant, il y a aussi que le succès des groupes des comités de vigilance va être aussi, si vous voulez, un risque pour eux, parce qu'ils vont être personnellement recherchés par Boko Haram et ciblés. Mais pendant qu'eux sont ciblés, leurs communautés vont aussi en fait être ciblées derrière. Donc, c'est-à-dire que toutes les communautés où des groupes de vigilance existent et sont forts deviennent aussi des cibles privilégiées de Boko Haram, augmentant donc la psychose au sein des communautés. Et l'embarras de l'État, c'est aussi la question du background des éléments qui se sont retrouvés dans les comités de vigilance. Et cet embarras se fait ressentir lorsque ces éléments font ressortir justement leur culture dans le grand banditisme, dans la rébellion en termes de prédation et d'abus sur les communautés. Et sur le terrain, cet embarras va plus loin par des exécutions sommaires, par des extorsions sur les communautés, des fois des viols, etc. Certains des membres des comités de vigilance sont allés plus loin, n'est-ce pas, en entrant dans l'économie criminelle de la contrebande ou bien de la revente du renseignement à Boko Haram, permettant au groupe de mieux cibler les communautés et les forces de sécurité. Donc, ceci pose la question, n'est-ce pas, d'anticiper le futur. Avec des éléments de si grand nombre, n'est-ce pas, habitués à vivre aux côtés de l'arme. Et citant ici Marielle Debos, qui, par rapport au Tchad, parle de vivre de par le fusil, se mettent en place en fait des carrières qui évoluent le long du fusil, soit en tant que bandit, soit en tant que membre d'un comité de vigilance, mais après le conflit, qu'en sera-t-il? Et la reconversion la plus facile semble à nouveau être la reconversion du groupe de vigilance vers un autre métier des armes, donc peut-être encore Boko Haram, une milice communautaire ou bien le grand banditisme. Ceci pose donc la nécessité de réfléchir et d'anticiper le futur. Et parce que d'émanation donc très locale, ces groupes sont malheureusement aussi, comme on le verra dans ces contextes, alignés en fait sur les fragmentations et les fractures identitaires, c'est-à-dire organisés selon des lignes communautaires, selon des lignes ethniques et des fois aussi des lignes religieuses. Donc, dans des contextes comme le bassin du lac Tchad, qui est un contexte, n'est-ce pas, d'insécurité larvée depuis avant Boko Haram, qui est un contexte de conflits intercommunautaires très réguliers. Et on l'a vu, par exemple, l'année 2021, dans une zone comme l'extrême nord du Cameroun, a été une année de répétition de conflits intercommunautaires entre éleveurs et agriculteurs notamment, entre éleveurs et pêcheurs, entre pêcheurs et éleveurs, etc. Mon collègue en parlera plus tard de ça pour le Nigeria. Mais dans un contexte pareil, justement, ces conflits ont préexisté à Boko Haram, ces conflits vont continuer après Boko Haram. Ça veut dire que ne pas gérer la question des comités de vigilance, c'est préparer en fait des supplétifs pour rejoindre et faire grandir ces conflits. Je vais m'arrêter là en disant donc simplement que aujourd'hui, l'on parle beaucoup, n'est-ce pas, des solutions post-crise dans le bassin du lac Tchad. Et ces solutions post-crise intègrent une approche holistique de défense d'un côté, mais aussi de développement pour essayer de résoudre ce qu'on considérerait comme les racines sociales et économiques de la crise. On parle aussi des questions de DDR, n'est-ce pas? Mais à ce jour, l'on n'a pas encore commencé à parler de la question du DDR pour ceux qui, comme Boko Haram, sont aussi armés. Et définitivement, nous pensons que si l'on ne considère pas maintenant la nécessité, n'est-ce pas, de mettre en place des politiques de démobilisation et de sortie de crise pour les comités de vigilance, c'est-à-dire le conflit de Boko Haram pourrait finir ou ne pas finir, mais on ne serait jamais sorti de l'insécurité dans le bassin du lac Tchad. Merci.
Thank you very much, Remaji. And I think with this notion of human security and how to say this shift of security from being a military and defense-oriented concept to a social and politically oriented or based concept, we are very good in a very good situation to to move on to our third presentation this morning. Our speaker Chukwuma Ume will talk about political ecology approach to these constellations of conflict Remaji was talking about in the case of the Lake Chad basin. Some brief words on our third speaker. Chukwuma Ume is since 2020 a lecturer at the Department of Agricultural Economics at the University of Nigeria in Nsukka, which is located in the federal state of Enugu in southeast Nigeria. Mr. Ume did accomplish his master's degree in environment and development from the Sustainability Research Institute at the University of Leeds in 2018, and he is currently pursuing his PhD in development economics at the Center for International Development and Environmental Research at Justus Liebig University in Gießen. His focus is on agroecology and sustainable food systems in southeast Nigeria. Previously, He had earned a bachelor's degree in agricultural economics at the University of Nigeria with the honorable mention of as first class and overall best graduating student in the 2013-14 graduating session. Both Uma's research interests and his scientific career pursued so far account for a strong transdisciplinary engagement with the intersecting fields of climate security, water governance, agriculture and agroecology, environmental sustainability, and last not least, the analysis of conflict dynamics such as the herder-farmer conflict, which will be the focus of his presentation today. Finally, Chukwuma Ume has so far been granted an impressive number of research grants and awards. He has thus received, to name just a few, the Oxford University African Initiative for Governance Award in 2019, the Climate Change Bursary Award from the School of Environment at the University of Leeds in 2017, and he has been granted a Next Generation Fellowship from the African Peacebuilding Network of the Social Science Research Council in New York. We look forward to your presentation, Chukwuma, on the pastoralist farmer crisis, which is currently being discussed as one of the most burning issues for societies of the large inland areas in West Africa, which are confronted with the intersecting fields of conflict conditioned by the degradation of land resources, the struggle for livelihoods, and the power dynamics shaped by politics, ethnicity, and religion. And you see perhaps already the association to what the papers of Christina and Remaji comprise. So I think we will move a step forwards with you. Please come to the floor, Chukwuma.
Thank you very much. Permit me to stand on the already existing protocol and deep dive into my presentation today, where I'll be looking at the determinants of this conflict. I argue in this study that unless we understand the drivers of these conflicts, it will be difficult to propose any solution or any way to handle them. So thank you very much for the previous presentation. It makes my work easy now. Thank you. I would be looking at the type of violences we have in Nigeria, the research question, the method I used, the results, the discussion, and finally give a way forward. First of all, I will try to be brief on giving you a recap or perhaps the different categorization, try to categorize the different conflicts that we have in Nigeria. The first one, which is actually the first to start, is the Boko Haram, which my colleague have really exhausted. The Boko Haram is actually located in the northern part of Nigeria, and recently they've been moving into the center, which is the capital in Abuja. But recently, there is the bandits, and these have become even more deadly than the Boko Harams. They've involved in killings that even Boko Harams cannot even dare. I'm sorry if we use killing as if it is something that is common, but actually, these are realities. So every morning in the newspaper, you hear about the bandits and the killings that they do and the kidnaps. But these bandits are not ideological. They are mostly for money. They kidnap, and if you don't pay ransom, they will end up killing the victims. This is unlike the Boko Haram, which is more ideological. They tend to, their motto is like Western education should be forbidden, the Boko Haram, but they still make use of the phone, the bombs, the gun produced by the Western knowledge, but yet they say it is forbidden. Apart from that, we have the third one emerging recently, the unknown gunmen. As the name implies, there have not been any reason why this set of people terrorize the country, and they are mostly concentrated at the southeast part of the country. Some people have linked them to the separationists in the south. And finally, the farmer-herder conflict, which mostly in the Middle Belt and in different parts of the country as well. And this is going to be the center of my talk in the next few minutes. So the farmer-herder crisis actually it started in 2010, the first incident of this conflict. And if you look at the chart by the right-hand side, you find the different, over the years from 2010 to 2020, the dynamics. It's not just concentrated only in Nigeria. We have them in Mali, in Burkina Faso as well. But you will find something interesting that when it started in 2010, the inability, and this is also with other types of violence like Boko Haram, the inability of the Nigerian government or military to check any of these crises. With time, they tend to move to other West African states. So from 2004-05, you see them trickling down to Mali and to Burkina Faso as well. So the farmer-herder conflict is conceptualized mostly as a crisis between the herders, which are mostly Muslim, and farmers who are mostly Christian. So there is a bit of a religious coloration to this conflict, but most studies in literature always attribute the causes or the cause of this conflict to climate change. Yes, so mostly they feel like the herders, because of the change in climate in the north, they move towards the south, and in the process, they encroach on the farmland, thereby leading to conflict. These conflicts have actually displaced thousands of people and even killed over 20,000 persons from 2010 when it began. These are some of the instances, horrible instances, unreasonable killing by the herders. In 2018, over 47 farmers in their field, in the rice farm. The herders went to the rice farm, brought them together and just killed all of them, with the military doing nothing. Sometimes the crisis or the violence happens for hours with no intervention. Sometimes they go to the house of these farmers in retaliation to maybe they kill their cows and burn down their house. These are some of the pictures. So what I argue in my study for the last 4 years has been that it's not actually the state of nature, but actually the nature of the states that fuel this conflict. So I look at the proposition by Kiaka, one of the top political ecologists in the world, who argued that environmental problems are actually political problems. And when we try to isolate the political and economic situation from this environmental and resource conflict, we tend to ignore the main drivers of this conflict. So the outcome of the interaction of political and economic processes within a society that preconditions resource conflict, and the process that give rise to and maintain and transform this conflict or relationship over time have for a long time been ignored in the literature. And this ignorance of these aspects of the drivers of conflict perhaps is what has been fueling the crisis, especially the farmer-herder conflict over time. So I argue that research must begin to look at the political and the economic factors that fuel conflict, especially the farmer-herder conflict. I try to use econometric methods to find the relationship between some of these factors and conflict occurring. So I look at Nigeria, for instance. When you look at the purple dots, these are the different farmer-herder conflict occurrences in Nigeria. And this is sourced from the ACLIDE, the Armed Conflict Report, from 2010 to 2020. So I try to divide the map of Nigeria into different pesos, like I got over 1,200 different pesos, because it is difficult to find some data about the different states. So what I simply did in this study was trying to divide the map of Nigeria into a small partition, about 27 by 27 kilometer each, and then look at if conflicts have occurred in the area. If there is no conflict in a particular peso, I assign it 0. If it is only one conflict in the area, 1. And then if there is more than one conflict, I assign it 2. So I was just trying to look at the drivers of conflict happening in any of these different locations. The first variable we tested was the climate variable. Look at rainfall and temperature. So we look at if there had been a change in temperature or rainfall 10 years prior to 2010 when the farmer header crisis began. We did that for rainfall as well. But beyond that, which is the center of our study, we look at economic variables as well. But because there is no state level GDP or economic variable, we use the night light. So we look at the intensity of light in the night in the different location to represent how developed a region or a location is. Then we also look at the political attitude and characteristics of the different individuals in the area. So we look at the changes in population as well, changes in political parties, whether it is in the rural or urban area, the number of ethnic groups in a particular location, number of religion, the type of vegetation, and some other variables as well. So we just use simple econometric design to look at the relationship between these variables mentioned and the occurrence of farmer header conflict in any of these locations. So fast forward, we find that rainfall actually had a very significant influence on conflict occurring in the area. So places where there have been where there have been a huge change in rainfall patterns, reduction in rainfall over these 10 years, have more tendency of recording this violence compared to where the rainfall had been, changes had been less. However, we did not find any of those relationships, a significant relationship in terms of temperature. Unlike the Boko Haram, which is mostly concentrated in the forest area, like the Sambisa forest, we found out that more of the farmer header conflict occur in the savanna regions. Then in terms of the political variables, we observe that areas where there is a better relationship between the people and their representatives, they have little or no farmer header conflict occurring in such area. Like the number of town hall meetings, like where the parliament members or the House of Representatives have constant town hall meetings with the people, there is less of violence occurring in the places. And also in areas where we have the ruling political party also being the ruling political party in the state level. For instance, if the president is from APC, which is a political party, and the state is also ruled by a governor from APC, there is less conflict occurring in such area. And also, most of the conflicts were also found to occur in the rural region, unlike in the urban region. Okay, so finally, drawing to conclusion, so just like what we have in literature, our results suggest that weather variables are very important factors or determinants of the farmer header conflict. But we also find evidence that political heterogeneity increases the likelihood of farmer header conflict occurring. And areas where the citizens have more contact with the government officials or representatives experience fewer occurrences of conflict situation. The results suggest that there is a need for a grassroots governance approach. It might be a way forward, and also dispute resolution mechanisms or policy or programs should emanate from the people. Based on this, we actually did a study with International Development Research Council in Canada, looking at hybridization in the provision of security, especially in regards to former header conflicts. And basically, hybridization, what we mean is a combination of the former security apparatus like the military or the police and a civilian local vigilantes. And we found that areas with civilian joint task force, that's where you have the civilian joining the police or the military in operation, experience greater success in achieving security. There are so many reasons, but we highlighted three. These local vigilantes, they know the community very well. They provide better intel and information for the security, and these are the people that are most hot. Most times, the military and the police are not really from the area. They are transferred or posted to the area, but these civilians is either they are the people that maybe their parents or their brothers have been killed as a result of this, so they are really hot and they are really intentional in fighting this crime. There are also several indications of success, like in Borno State, the civilian task force just in the last quarter of 2021 has able to foil over 17 attacks in the last quarter of 2021. And when these civilians are being armed, example, there is a group called the Amotekun in the southwest. When they are being armed, they were able to counter over 7 attacks against the header farmer crisis, 7 attacks just this year. So with that regional government, there are 3 major regions in the country, the north, the west, and the south. They are beginning to form the local armed vigilante groups like the Amotekun in the south, and you have what they call the Ebube Ago in the east, and you have the Arewa youths in the west. They are beginning to arm them to counter all these terrorist insurgencies. But however, I feel like more effort needs to be done to formalize these local vigilantes. But at the same time, we need to check their future behavior because most times at the end, they end up being the terror themselves if they are not well checked. So thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so much for this interesting talk. And now we have the pleasure to, well, I have the pleasure to present to you our commentator, Dr. Gemma van der Haar. She received her PhD from Wageningen University in 2001 with a study of land reform and state formation in an indigenous region of Chiapas in Mexico. After postdocs at Nijmegen University and Utrecht University focused on peace and conflict studies, she returned to Wageningen in 2006, where she worked at the then Group of Disaster Studies and started to teach on humanitarian aid, reconstruction, and national resources. With the return to Wageningen, Gemma started to study land issues and governance in conflict-affected settings, including Burundi, Uganda, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. She is currently part of a program on land registration in such settings, which includes collaborations with Nijmegen University and Louvain, as well as partners in Burundi and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Gemma is also a founding member of Landdec, the Dutch Land Academy, which brings together a partnership of knowledge institutes and NGOs in the Netherlands, subsidized by the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs around the issue of land governance, and since the end of 2019 serves as one of its chairs. Over the past 3 years, Gemma has contributed to a PhD training also. Among others, she created an award-winning course on epistemology, difficult word, of fieldwork in conflict-affected settings. Some of Gemma's recent publications include From Resolving Land Disputes to Agrarian Justice, Dealing with the Structural Crisis of Plantation Agriculture in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo in the Journal of Peasant Studies in 2022, very recent. A second publication, Necessity or Choice, Women's Migration to Artisanal Mining Regions in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo in the Canadian Journal of African Studies in 2020. Claim Making as a Social Practice, Land, Politics and Conflict in Africa in the journal Geoforum in 2020. And last but not least, there are many more, but I can't cite them here all. Living Maoist Gender Ideology, Experiences of Women Ex-Combatants in Nepal in the International Feminist Journal of Politics. So that's a very wide range of topics, and so we are curious to hear your comments. The floor is yours, Gemma.
Thank you. Indeed, I have a tendency to be interested in many issues, as was clear from, and regions. So that, in a way, made my task today very interesting, but also a bit complicated, in the sense that each of the 3 papers on which I can reflect, they merit an extensive discussion, and they each represent a considerable scholarship in political ecology, in security studies, and of course we don't have time to go extensively into each of them. So what I've tried to do is to interweave them a little bit, and also with a view to engaging you, the audience, in thinking about those different presentations, the efforts made to understand violence and conflict, how can they help us understand patterns in the production and reproduction of violence and insecurity in the world of today. So that has guided my comment, and I apologize that there will be many things I won't be able to touch upon. Let me briefly say something about each of the papers in terms of how I think they are very significant in terms of what they tell us about the production and reproduction of violence. The first paper on Colombia shows us how paramilitary groups use violence to stop activists from defending their territories. And it shows how violence is a part of this expansion of resource frontiers. I think this is a very powerful idea. It is, I'm personally very concerned about the rise of violence against activists. Colombia is topping the lists, but it is expanding to Africa as well, Uganda being one of those countries. So this is definitely a pattern that we need to pay attention to and try to understand in our work. Then the second one is talking, the one that on chat was talking to us about how the lack of protection that people experience, the violence that they experience in different dimensions of their lives, is such that they have to organize for their own security. And the last speaker also touched upon this in the end of his presentation. This is also a very important dynamic, also because of, because of the, in a way, abandonment that speaks from it, the lack of commitment of states to provide security to the citizens, which is ultimately the main justification of existence. but also because, as the last speaker hinted at, there is a specific risk in the creation of those groups, and there's a very fine line between working for protection and starting to be an abuser. So this is also important to highlight. And then finally, from the last paper, it shows us how farmer-herder conflict is, yes, about resources, but entangled with all sorts of political dynamics in specific settings. Very complex interaction about which I will say a little bit more. We see violence as a practice appearing in these different presentations, and what also becomes clear is that the practice of violence serves different purposes. And it makes no sense, or we can make no sense of violence outside of a consideration of these purposes. Put very bluntly, finding a group that is armed can mean very different things, and will only make sense if we see for what they are armed and on whose behalf they use their means of violence. So, and I see two big patterns here. One is using arms to claim, to extend this resource frontier that Christina so eloquently presented. And the other use of violence to protect communities from harm. In both cases, we see groups with arms who move outside of, or at least partly outside of state control, but what they do is rather different. I find the notion of the moving frontier as creating insecurity, and the moving frontier as relying on violence in order to be moved, an extremely compelling idea. And one of my questions that I want to raise to the audience, but also to the other speakers, is could we see terrorism in Boko Haram, but also in other places? I'm also thinking of northern Mozambique. Could we understand terrorism and the violence it implies also in these terms as a particular form of such frontier expansion? I would be interested to hear what you think about that. Then the idea of the state, how the state is implied. It didn't come out so much in the first paper, but I'm sure there would be something to say about it there. The second speaker shared this interesting notion of security governance, and it suggests to me the question, how about we make a little analytical shift away from thinking how the state is not able to provide security and is deficient in its security governance, to think about how the state may be implied in governing insecurity, maybe actually implied in the production of insecurity because of being implied in the stakes of moving this resource frontier. So there might be strategic stakes for the state as such, or state actors in having these resource frontiers extend. So violence is not something that the state is impossible or incapable of stopping, but something that is instrumental also to its goals. I would be curious to hear your viewpoints. On the farmer-herder conflict, I have been quite intrigued, I must say, last speaker. I hope we have some time over coffee to discuss further how you get from the very, I think, sharply argued need to take a political ecology perspective and then move to econometrics in your methodology. It puzzles me, but hopefully we will have time. Because I was missing a bit there the anti-pastoralists' policies that are often cited in the literature on farmer-herder conflicts. And now, since I told you I'm so interested in this idea of the moving frontier, I was wondering, could we see anti-pastoralist policies also as part of that moving frontier in this way of, well, blocking the access of pastoralists to certain areas. And I think you go quite some way already in making us see that these farmer-herder conflicts are part of, well, deeper and broader constellations of contestation. But I think there's room to question that even further, to bring that even further. And finally, perhaps 2 more things. One suggestion and then 1 question. It's interesting in the papers to recognize the different analytical moves that are being made and that we need to make in order to understand the production and reproduction of violence. One I would call zooming out. I think political ecology has made major contributions to the field in stressing how violent events that we see need to be understood as reflections of violent structures. So we need to deepen and broaden our understanding. How are these events situated in these broader contestations and antagonisms? So it's important that we keep doing that, zooming out. We also need to zoom in, and we also have seen examples in the presentation about that. In the presentations about that. Zooming into particular locations, what is happening there? How is what we call conflict or violence entangled with other kinds of dynamics going on there? And I was very intrigued by the connection made between party political competition and the farmer-herder conflicts. That brings along a very intriguing and important and hotly debated issue, and that is that of causality. When we talk about conflict, we can talk about drivers of conflict. When we see farmer-herder conflicts and political competition happening alongside each other, is the one causing the other, or are they mutually influencing each other? When we zoom in, that is the kind of dynamics we can start to disentangle. Now, a final question that I just wrote down, triggered by the last presentation about climate change. We hear it all the time, more and more, as we talk about resource conflicts. I see, of course, I share the concern about climate change and how it might, all the impacts it may have on the ground, on resources and on people. I, however, also see a danger that climate change may be used to depoliticize our understanding of conflict. It's an easy way out if you don't want to question how certain policies or how certain choices of the state or how certain development discourses contributed to dispossession. So that's the last question I want to pose to you again and to you. Do you recognize that risk of using climate change to steer away our attention from the political dynamics that underlie many of the conflicts that we see? I think I'll leave it there. I hope I was not too late.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Gemma, for your comment and also for all the interesting talks. And now we will stick to the format we had yesterday. So we will have a first round of questions from the audience, and then the presentators and Gemma, of course, will have the opportunity to respond, and then we'll make another round. So questions, comments, raise your hands, please.
Thank you for your presentations. Due to the war in Ukraine, German Chancellor Scholz asked Colombian President Ivan Duque for more imports of coal, leading to an expansion of the El Cerrejón mine in La Guajira. So I would like to ask Ms. Dietz, how big do you consider the impact of international partners such as Germany on this violence and this violence of peace?
Mm-hmm. Over there.
Thank you especially for the great presentations and also the comments. It was very interesting. I was wondering, especially regarding the conflicts in Nigeria, if you could elaborate a little bit on the relationships between the state and the vigilante committees, because it seems to me if the conflicts also arise out of the state not offering enough security for their population, but the vigilante committees also working together with the state in some ways. What's the perspective of the vigilante committees toward their state system, toward their government and their governance? Yeah, that would be interesting. Thank you.
Further comments or questions at the moment? Yeah.
Thank you very much for the 3 interventions. I was wondering if you could develop more on sustainable solutions to conflict related with agrarian sustainability, and in what extent the different vigilantes and armies are involved in favor or against those sustainability solutions, and how do you see the possible solutions for the agrarian problems in both regions? Like, which ways do you think could be sustainable in a long term, thinking on environmental justice?
Okay, thank you very much. I think we will make a break here and give the presentators a chance to respond. We have already many topics and important topics on the table. So would you like to start, Christina?
Do I have to do anything? Do I have to switch that on or anything?
I don't think so.
Okay, is it working? Yeah. Okay. Yes. I'll focus on the first question regarding the role of international partners that import, in this case, coal from Colombia, on the increase or expansion of violence in resource extractivist regions, like the coal mining regions of the northern part of Colombia, where the Cerrejón mine that you mentioned is located. Well, actually, I think there has been a very intense struggle by human rights organizations that are trying from a transnational perspective to link violence against social activists, indigenous groups, and also trade unionists in these coal mining regions in Colombia, to kind of link the relationship between this violence and the import of resources from these mining areas. And one kind of pressure argument or moment that has been developed in this struggle is to make aware the importers, not only the German government, but also the energy companies, RWE, EnBW, Vattenfall, and so on, in Germany, to make them aware of what is actually happening, make them aware of zooming into the context situations where the coal is being extracted from, which means to make them politically aware that through their kind of, they have power. They have power in kind of making an influence on the companies that are extracting actually the coal. So I think if there was no, the situation with the Ukraine war has changed the whole scenario, as we all know, in the energy policies, the global energy policies, a lot. Nevertheless, I think what is not being done sufficiently by German governments, by European governments, by the companies particularly, is to kind of higher the pressure on those companies that extract resources in the global south for for bringing these resources into the global markets and kind of fulfill the demands on the global markets. So with the Lieferkettengesetz, for example, there are some first possibilities of kind of increasing this pressure that can be done. Nevertheless, from my point of view, it's not enough. So in bilateral negotiations, for example, between the German government and, I guess, the new government in Colombia, these negotiations will continue due to the need to import coal and other fossil fuels in at least next months from other regions than Russia and the Ukraine, particularly from Russia. I think there will be ongoing negotiations. So one kind of political pressure that needs to be kind of also formulated by movements and so on and social organizations is to kind of pressurize the German government, the European governments to make clear that, okay, we need that, we want that coal, but we don't want it under any conditions. So I think there can be more pressure being put on, not necessarily only on the governments in the global south, but particularly on the companies, which are transnational companies. It's Glencore that is running 100% Cerrejón mine. It's a Swiss company. So I think the pressure should be put on mainly also on the companies and not only on the national governments, which is not being done from my point of view sufficiently. So maybe I leave that here for the moment. I could continue with other questions, but I give the word to other people first.
Would you succeed, Remaji?
So let me now try my English. I will start by thanking Gemma for the comments. Regarding this question of frontier and expanding the frontier, when you look at terrorism, beyond all the rhetorics regarding religion, there are a lot of other issues that are coming along. And when you look at a group like Boko Haram, first of all, you need, as you say, maybe to zoom out and link it to the international jihad agenda. And so when we come to the structure of a group like ISIS, you come then to the question of controlling territories, controlling people, controlling mainly resources. And then it's in a way a continual fighting against the state, on controlling those territories, on controlling the resources and controlling the people. And the rhetoric of Boko Haram is about following the model of ISIS, creating a Dawla, Islamiyya Dawla. And so when you talk about Dawla, then you bring back this concept of frontier, even a kind of a physical frontier. What is the frontier between the Nigerian, the Chadian, the Cameroonian, and the Niger state, and the frontier of the Dawla? And even though there was no materiality of such a frontier, you see that all this war is about expanding and respanding frontiers regarding resources, people, and territories. So I think it's a concept that is very useful in understanding the security and insecurity dynamics that are on in the region, actually. Very fast on the second question about looking at the state in a way also as an actor that is just not trying to produce security but failing in doing it, but maybe rather also as an actor that is trying to manage insecurity, governing insecurity. If you take the perspective of people like Thomas Bishenk, Olivier Tsada, etc., when looking at the state from below, I mean what the state does when it works, so state that works. When we work on what is going on, actually, we also look at what people are doing when they are producing security. And we come to what we call economies of violence. And we see that in the case of Boko Haram, when we talk about governing security, we see that it's also more about bringing in insecurity by the state actors first, but also, in a way, taking advantage of the conflict situation for some criminal businesses. So we if we disaggregate this understanding of the state, limiting it to what people representing the state in those very local settings are doing, we see that clearly the state is part of this insecurity while officially trying to bring security or to manage insecurity. So it's a very complex situation on the ground. So I'll stop there.
Chuguma?
Yes, just to add to it, I think if you look at the policies, just like you mentioned, that the federal government tried to enact, for instance, the Ruga settlement scheme or policy, it's just a matter of expanding the frontier for this a jihadist movement. I will not go into details for obvious reason, but you find out that the government is asking every state in the country to dedicate a portion of their land for the herders as a response or as a response to the conflict. And these are land owned by the farmers, by ordinary people, and you are converting the land for a particular set of people. And these herders, they are under the umbrella of MACBEN. It's called the Meeti Allah Cattle Breeders Association, and people at the helm of the politics or government are the patrons of this association. So there is no way you can differentiate or take away the influence of the government and their policies in fueling this crisis. And to respond to the question about the state and the vigilantes, and also how sustainable it can be, I think it's also as a result of the structure of the Nigerian state. For instance, the president is known as the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. So if there is a crisis happening in my backyard, the local government chairman or the head of the police cannot send out the troops or the police to quell it until he calls the president, and the president said you can go. So it takes like 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours before you see a response team from the state. And there have been issues of devolve these powers to the state governors. Let the state governor have the power to control the security apparatus. So in response to that, these states are beginning to form and to equip their own vigilantes who they can control. So for me, I think the way forward, the sustainability should be a kind of a state policing, just like you have in the United States, where you have the New York State Police, where you have the different security apparatus being domiciled in the state and even to the local. That's the way we can get, the way we can have a sustainable security apparatus in the country. Yeah.
Remaji, you would like to add something?
Yeah, just some on this question regarding the relationship between the states and the different vigilante groups. I think this relation, if it was in French, it was what we might call the relation très incestueuse. To me, they have been set to respond to a vacuum in terms of security. And normally, as I said, the state is the only one entitled to the use of violence. And when you keep them at the preventive level, it's something else. But what's happening in Nigeria, they are actually working hand in hand with the national army, using weapons as they use also. But the problem is that they are responding to different kind of rules. While the army officially received some training on humanitarian laws, etc., those guys, they received none. And so the state is really embarrassed using those guys, but at the same time, seen as the state actually is very conscious of being unable of bringing security alone, they profit from their presence. So the question is, in the long term, what will happen? And if we see how actually, like in Borno State, they are putting so many means in those groups, it's something that is dangerous. I mean, we have a federal state, but at the same time, if it's in the law that no federal state should have an army, arming the civilian joint task force is a way of creating a kind of local army. So these are things that in the long term will pose a lot of problem, I think.
Mm-hmm. Christina, you also wanted to add something?
Yes, three brief points. I wanted to reflect on the question by you on the possible sustainable solutions. Let's call it on the agrarian question or the agrarian conflict. I'm not sure whether I got your question right, actually, to be honest. Nevertheless, what I would like to say is that we are facing a paradoxical situation when it comes to agrarian topics and agrarian crises, which means that on a global scale, we are witnessing a globalized agrarian production system that is highly commoditized, that is highly commercialized, and that is controlled by very few highly potential transnational companies. Whereas on the ground, we are seeing kind of dispossessions, we are seeing displacements, we are seeing kind of policies, agrarian policies in very different contexts, not only in the global south, only in the global north. If I look at the gap, the common agricultural policies in the European Union and the transformations that it actually triggered in the agrarian production system in Europe, what we can see is that on the ground, policies that are actually supporting agricultural production in a way like agroecology production, sustainable production systems are disappearing more and more. So from this paradoxical situation that there is a call for more agroecological, sustainable production systems, but which are not politically supported in many contexts, and on the other hand, a global agriculture that actually is more driven by profits of transnational companies. What is needed is a politicization, not in terms of like easy answers, but a politicization of food production in a more sustainable way, which goes beyond kind of beyond easy answers. So I think this is, and which goes beyond blaming some political actors to not impose correct policies on the national level, because I think this is not enough. I think we need to link the local with the global situation to overcome that paradoxical situation. I mean, this is a very general answer, but this is the only thing that comes to my mind when I reflected on your question. Just 1 and 2 points quickly. Thank you, Gemma, for your comments, which I found really kind of inspiring, reflecting all of our presentations. And 2 things I want to underline, and I absolutely agree with you that the relationship that has become very important in the violent peace and conflict studies over the last 10 years between climate change and conflict, we need to disentangle that obvious causality, which from my point of view is a way of depoliticizing the context conditions that interfere with these conflicts, which means that through this debate, what is happening is the introduction of, from my point of view, from my reading, a climate deterministic understanding of a social phenomena. Conflicts are still a social phenomena, and we need to kind of study the interrelationships between these different transformation processes, but not argue in a causal way, which I think is really important when it comes to conflicts over resources or over the environment or over nature, because it makes us not see anymore the underlying structural conditions and factors that actually create these conflicts in the first place.
Yes,
I leave it here.
Yes, thank you so much. So we have time for another round. Please be brief. Any questions, comments? Yeah, over there.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentations. One maybe common question, I don't know how to actually where to locate it, but something that I have been reflecting on a bit for quite some time. What is actually the state when we say the state? I think it's very important to go back to that question and try to historicize it, and maybe think about the whole history of the state, especially for the cases on Nigeria and Chad. So that would be maybe some suggestion I would have. Let's go back to that basic question and then try to look at the state. Try to maybe decenter also a bit the state from the understandings, the definitions we've been having of the state. Just let's think about the local ideas of the state. If we think about the issues we're discussing from that perspective, maybe there are some insights we will be able to provide. So that is one question. And then perhaps the whole topic on violence, perhaps also violence, we need to look at it from, especially in the Nigeria and Chadian cases, maybe a conversation on the social construction of fighting. Fighting as a social becoming element, especially if we look at how actually people become, how people emerge, how people move into their being part of the society, part of the community. So we can relax a bit on the violence part of that, and then look at from a sociological and anthropological perspective these kind of social mobility, quote unquote, processes or element, or however we want to call it. So these are the two things I wanted to share with you. Thank you
so much. Further questions, comments? Then I can add a... Is there one? Oh, okay.
Thank you very much to all the presenters. Given my own interests, I'm going to ask kind of a question about gender. And I'm wondering, kind of building off the last question, the extent to which ideas about masculinity and performance and manlyhood are also linked to these episodes and patterns of violence. I'm thinking particularly in African states, but in my own research, I found that the idea of performing a particular kind of masculinity that is under threat is very central to violence. And I'm also, in another totally not related way, thinking about the global arms trade and how the circulation of weapons and the militarization of states, particularly in Africa, are linked to these conflicts. So can the speakers, touch on any of these issues as they may or may not be relevant? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I just want to add one aspect, and I would ask you if you could zoom in a bit and, in your cases, talk a bit about the actors of violence. The communities are a construction, and so who are the actors inside the communities? We have very class interests involved. Paramilitary forces in Colombia were built as a defense, but as a defense of large landholder interests, and so on. So the contexts are quite different, and the problem you also addressed, what will be the future of the self-defense groups, seems to me to be related very closely to these issues. Whose interests are they pursuing? Christina, I want you to start and be brief.
Yes, thank you for the questions and the comments again. Maybe I start with that final question by you, Wolfgang. Who are the actors involved here on the communal level, on the local level? I talked a bit about the social actors, the affected groups. When it comes to the perpetrators, like the ones who actually exercise violence against social actors and people on the ground, it is becoming more difficult actually to actually kind of categorize them or classify them or name them, because most of the killings or threatenings are not being kind of cleared through judicial processes. So the old debate about the impunity in this context is still ongoing. Nevertheless, what one can say from research that has been done on the topic in Colombia so far is that that it continues, like it is transformed former paramilitary groups that have kind of also through the history of the peace process have transformed themselves into new neo-paramilitary groups that work together now with drug cartels, that work together with transnational companies, that are in a way also interlinked with formal security forces like the formal military group, and so on. So it is a number of actors that in a